Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started here, and in order to stay tight on time. This is Susan Simon. I'm on the Averse Advisory Board, and I'm here with my colleague Sharifs Background.
Hello.
Hello, hello. And Clark from the MLC.
Hi there.
Hello, Clark. And so thanks for inviting us in. We're really excited to be here. Sharif is going to share some tips and some techniques on how to make better decisions in business, but also in life. Right, Sharif?
Yes.
Okay,
I will.
I could use that.
Yeah.
So Clark, you ever make the wrong decision?
Absolutely not. Never have.
All right.
Well, that'd be a wrong thing to say. I've made major blunders.
All right. Well, you're not alone then. And this is shocking to me, but I saw recently in a Forbes article that 98% of executives and managers fail to apply best practices when making decisions. And so many organizations don't align with strategic objectives, and it costs companies millions of dollars, but it also impacts our careers. And it's when we make big wrong decisions, that's when it gets in the way of real results. So Sharif has spent his whole career researching decision making and developing a method to do it better. So Sharif, you're going to save us from our next bad decision?
I will try.
Okay. I think you've got a big task.
Yeah.
All right, good. So great. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Everybody is on listen-only mode to help with background noise, but we want to take all your questions, so please use the Q&A feature. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It's not the chat, but it says Q&A. Clark, do you see that?
I do.
At the bottom of your screen? Okay, good. And we'll keep our eye on this as they come in, and we'll try to get to your questions. We also want it to be interactive, so there's going to be a few polls, and we want you to respond to those because we'll have fun with that. And we'll give you the results right on the spot so you can see how others respond as well. And then at the end, we'll send you the slide deck and provide you contact information so you can reach us directly, and we're happy to speak with any of you individually. So we'll look forward to it. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Clark.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you for being here, Sharif.
Of course. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for hosting and inviting us.
You bet. MLC is happy to do that. And also welcome everybody out in webinar land. I can't see you, but I know you're there. So this subject is pretty interesting. I've never really thought much about how I make decisions. Like most people, I guess I just do it like from the gut, based on the information I have.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. I mean, we always go with our gut, and sometimes we don't get it right. Most of the time we don't get it right. And if it's a personal decision, maybe the consequences are not that great, but for businesses to go with their gut making decisions, that's the problem.
Yeah. Well, you've been doing this for a while, so you ought to know a lot about it. For those out there, Sharif's the CEO of Averse. He's also the founder of Pyramid Consulting International. His work in removing decision bias has spanned about 25 plus years. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty fascinated in this because it's something that we can do. If we can learn to eliminate decision bias, we can be much more successful in our lives and our business. So,
What's on the radar for today, Clark, in terms of agenda?
Well, we're going to look at what kind of decisions that we're talking about making. And for instance, strategic lean decisions would be eliminating waste from capital budgeting, for instance. But also we'll be looking at how to eliminate waste in processes and maybe some personal examples or some examples out of personal life. We're also going to be looking at prioritization of initiatives on Lean Journey. Like for instance, initially you might use storyboarding or Delphi methodologies, generate a lot of ideas, and then you group those ideas by voting, and you end up with basically a group of individual biased priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll be looking at the 12 biases basically that impact making the best decisions most frequently. And then a 5-step process to simplify the complexity of big decisions. Big decisions meaning things like the cabinet, Trump's cabinet right now dealing with the Syrian issue. Those are big decisions. So Sharif, to kick things off, maybe you could share with us a little bit about why this is a passion of yours? What's inspired your work?
Sure. So it started a while ago, 1992. I started doing my PhD research here at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I was particularly fascinated with decision modeling. And I started looking into decision modeling, and I was reading a book by Thomas Sati, who was one of the pioneers who started working on this area. And one sentence that he said in the book had a big impact on me. He said, objectivity is nothing more than shared subjectivity. Think about that. Objectivity is nothing more than shared subjectivity. Isn't that the truth? So, for example, 12 inches is 1 foot, right? But why is that? Because some people a long time ago decided that that's the case.
Yeah.
So I'm now 6 feet tall because of that. If they had decided that 1 foot is much longer than that, I might be 3 feet tall. So as long as we share subjectivity, as long as we have certain criteria that we all agree on, and we are the decision makers, then that can be turned into objectivity. So that fascinated me, and it prompted me to continue my studies in decision modeling, particularly how to include that subjective aspect into decision models and transform subjectivity to objectivity. So I finished my PhD in Michigan, and then I started working for consulting companies. I worked for Deloitte for a few years, and then I started my own practice. And now, overall, I spent more than 25 years working with Fortune 250 organizations in modeling their decisions and how to create a structured decision-making process.
Well, that's pretty impressive. Here's a question. A lot of people would say that subjectivity probably can't be measured, but you're saying it can be. So could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think subjectivity can be measured. As a matter of fact, during my research, I used the utility theory to measure subjectivity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you talk about something like intuition, you cannot measure intuition because it's based on experience. But subjectivity, you can measure. Let me give you an example. If you're buying a car and you look at two similar cars, and one is $20,000 and one is $10,000, you know that the $20,000 is more expensive than the $10,000 because we have the number scale. That's already established. We all know that. But if you decide that blue cars should score more than red cars, I mean, if you're in University of Michigan versus Ohio State, that's for sure true. But there's no scale that has been developed that says blue is better than red, right? But if we do that, if we do the decision making and we decide that blue is going to score more than red, then we can use these criteria in creating scales that will transform that subjective criteria into objective.
So if you remove, or at least lessen to as the extent possible, subjectivity, then does your method eliminate bias in decision making? So
let's be fair. So as long as humans make decisions, there will always be some form of bias, okay? But what we are trying to do here is to minimize this bias as much as possible. So working with a lot of organizations over the year, I've learned that there are two things that we can do to minimize the impact of decision bias. Number one, awareness. Just being aware of those biases and understand what they are. Number two is having a discipline or a structured decision-making process that will help you uncover those biases as you go through the process, so that all the areas, you uncover areas of thinking before they become errors of judgment, right? So structured. So number one, being aware of the biases. Number two, a structured discipline process.
Got it. Okay. So
and that's what I want to share with you today is how to be aware of these biases, and then how to establish a structured process for decision making.
Okay. So let's start with what kind of decision?
So we make a lot of decisions every day, and for the past 20 years, I've been applying the structured method for decision making in a lot of applications. I've worked with utility companies and hospitals to prioritize their capital allocation. I've worked with government agencies like the state of Michigan to prioritize their lean projects. I work with healthcare systems to prioritize their deferred maintenance and facility infrastructure projects. I worked in software selection. So there's capital allocation, there's resource allocation, there's time allocation. Because to me, a decision is an allocation of some sort, right? So with respect to resource allocation, I work with automotive suppliers to help them evaluate and select among different suppliers. I work with time allocation in the areas of task planning and internal initiative allocation. So anything that requires prioritization of alternatives to me is a decision-making problem. And I work with a lot of organizations to do that.
Okay.
And just the area that I want to focus on here is that I was talking to a client of mine, without mentioning any names, and is a senior vice president at a large utility company. And he told me once that, they started this 3-year program to introduce more reliability into their grid and their network. And he said that they spent about $3 billion on this. And then now that 3 years later, that these projects are being implemented and completed, they are finding out that they wish they had selected other projects, not the ones that they selected. So one of the things that I want to emphasize today is that what we want to achieve is we want to understand the impact of your decisions immediately and not when the project is complete.
Yeah, and I think, Sharif, that's been something that's surprising to me is, we all make a lot of big and little decisions every day. And it's one thing if you go with your gut on like where to go to dinner tonight. But what I found surprising is how frequently in business people go with their gut on really big decisions.
You're absolutely correct.
It could be bad.
You're absolutely correct. Organizations make decisions like that all the time.
Okay, so the first poll that we're going to ask you to complete is what categories of decisions are you involved in predominantly with your organization? Capital, resource, or time allocations? You have about 20 seconds to do that. And down at the bottom of the screen, you should see the poll.
Okay, yeah, it looks like the results are coming in. Time allocation is in the lead.
Yeah, it's amazing, yeah.
Coming around the turn.
Yeah.
Maybe a few more seconds. Yeah, so it's fascinating because the results here says that 71% of the audience are involved in time allocation decision, and then 21% is involved in resource allocation, and only 7% is involved in capital allocation. So that's great. So we have a mixture of people that are doing a variety of decisions in their organizations.
Okay, so those are the types or categories of decisions. Now let's dig into what are the 12 biases that you figure in that happen to us the most?
So what I will do, Clark, is I will talk about each bias very quickly.
Okay.
And then I will say example of this bias. And then what are the techniques that we can use to eliminate these biases? And by doing this, I hope that I can provide a little bit of awareness on those biases. So the first one that I want to talk about is anchoring, which is basically that what we see or hear first feels the most important. And this leads us to give disproportionate weight to the first piece of information that we receive. And anchors can come in many forms. It can be a comment from a colleague, a statistic that we read in a report, a past event or trend. And anyone who has been buying anything will appreciate the fact that you can get anchored by the salesperson giving you a number. You go buy a car, they tell you $20,000, then you say, how about 18? But if the salesperson tells you it's $15,000, you're not going to say, how about 18? You're going to say, how about 13? They try to anchor you to that. And that happens a lot, for example, when you're doing marketing. Because a lot of companies, when they do marketing, they project future product sales by looking only at the past sales figure, even though the circumstances might have changed completely, but they anchor themselves to the historical data that they have. So one of the things that some of the techniques that you can do to really eliminate that anchoring is, first of all, pursue other lines of thought. Ask questions that start with like, what if, to understand the problem a little bit more. Think about the problem on your own before consulting others, and try to seek information and opinions from a variety of people to widen your frame of reference. The second bias is the status quo, and anyone who's done budgeting knows that very well. So we prefer things to stay the same. And if you fall in that trap, it will compel us to maintain the current situation, even though there might be other better alternatives that exist. So for examples, again, I mentioned budgets.
Yeah.
So when you do budgets in an organization, oftentimes organizations say, well, this is the amount of money that we gave to this department last year. Let's give them the same amount this year. They do that because it's easier.
Yeah, so sometimes being risk averse can actually be creating more risk into your equation. You might not even be aware.
You're absolutely right. That's a great point, Susan. And so a lot of time mergers fail because the acquiring executives are afraid to rocking the boat at the acquired company by imposing a new management structure too soon. So they don't do anything. They leave everything status quo, and then the merger would fail. So maintaining the status quo, may still be the best option, but you don't want to choose it just because it's comfortable, okay? So to eliminate this bias, you need to ask yourself if the status quo really serves your objectives. It all depends on what your objectives and what your priorities are. You need to carefully evaluate the pros and cons of each possibility. Should we stay with the status quo, or should we change the status quo? And then you have to avoid, this is very important, you have to avoid exaggerating the effort or cost that it will take to switch from the status quo, because people exaggerate that a lot, so they get afraid of switching from the status quo. The third one is the sunk cost. So we make decisions that justify past choices. And, we perpetuate mistakes of the past by making decisions that justify prior choices, even when they no longer seem valid. And why do we do this? Because we do this because we're afraid to admit that we took the wrong path in the first place, okay? So a study that's been done in a major U.S. bank shows that employees responsible for originating bad loans were far more likely to advance additional funds than employees who later took over the accounts. And anyone who works in any organization understand you start a bad project, it's not producing the results, but you're responsible for that project, and you don't want to look like you did a bad mistake. You keep trying to make the project work, keep trying to make the project. So the bank study showed that employees who took over old accounts, they were faster to eliminate these bad debts as opposed to the employees who actually originated the loans. Okay, so that's
interesting.
So that's something to think about. So to be able to eliminate that sunk cost trap, you need to ask for input from people who weren't involved in the original decision. You need to always remind yourself that even the best manager make mistakes, so it's okay. And don't cultivate a fear of failure. If you fail and you had the best intentions, it's okay.
Better to adjust.
Better to adjust and eliminate. And the best thing to do, that when you find yourself in a hole, the best thing to do is to stop digging, right? That's always remember that. The fourth one is confirming evidence. We seek information that supports our existing point of view. It leads us to seek out information that supports what we already think and reject anything that doesn't. I was working with a CEO of a company one time, and he wanted to cancel a plant expansion project, and everybody was against that. Everybody wanted the plant expansion project. So he called another CEO of a company similar to his, and he asked her, what did you do? And she said, oh, we didn't do the plant extension because, so he actually called her because he knew in advance that she actually supports that decision. And so, and we do this all the time in life. We want to do something, we talk to people that we know that they think like us. So to ensure that when you make these choices, it's a smart one, try to examine all evidence. Don't just talk to people that agree with you. Try to come up with counter argument, and try to get different opinions about things that you want to do. Number 5 is framing. Framing is the way that we state the problem. And the way we state the problem influences what we decide. So when we misstate a problem by defining a choice as a gain or a loss, even though it's really neither one, then that's not the right way to go. So when we talk about framing, it's exactly like the glass half full versus the glass half empty. If I presented you a problem as the glass half full, you would be more inclined to accept it as if I presented it as the glass half empty, even though it's exactly the same thing. So to be able to limit the adverse effects of framing, try to take some precautions. Don't automatically accept the initial frame that was presented to you. Always try to view the problem in various ways. Try to pose the problems neutrally, not as a gain or a loss, okay? And then try suggesting different frames to look at problems. The sixth bias is the estimating forecasting trap, or bias. And I will go a little bit faster on this. So this is divided into three things. Overconfidence, which is we put too much trust in the accuracy of our forecasts. So consider the amount of money wasted on ill-fated project ideas just because the managers stick with those overly bullish estimates about market potential. You think that the market is going to be great, you're very confident, you make an estimate, it's a catastrophe. So to reduce the effect of overconfidence, try to avoid being anchored by your initial estimate. Try to imagine circumstances in which the actual figure would fall below your expectation or above your expectation. So try to adjust the range. Don't be overconfident. You have to study the facts. And the opposite of that really is the next one, which is prudence. Prudence is excessive caution. It's the excessive caution that you exercise when you try to predict uncertain events.
And would you say different personalities? Some personalities lean toward being overconfident, while other personalities lean toward being more prudent?
Absolutely. And I work with a lot of companies, and sometimes they try to estimate projects, and they're so afraid that their estimate is going to be low, and they're not going to have enough money to do the project, so they pad their estimates. Mm-hmm. And what happens, and if you're doing budgeting for any company, you will know that, is at the end of the year, you actually don't go over budget, you go way below budget. I work with large organizations that leave about 30–40% of the money of their budget on the table just because they were overestimating their budget. Mm-hmm. from the fear of not having enough money to do the project. So put a lot of money in it, the project comes under budget, and you leave a lot of money unused at the end of the year.
So anybody that has unused money,
and then recallability. Sometimes you get afraid just because you recall it. You put undue weight to recent dramatic events. If you listen to some traumatic events on the media or something, you think that that's always going to happen, and you start putting that into your estimate. You start questioning, if I face this, should I put a lot of contingency in my estimate, for example, to do that? So this recallability is kind of, you don't have to be influenced by events that's only rare, but you don't think they are rare because you just hear them all the time. So to make sure that you don't do that, try to question your estimates, try to understand the facts. Now, when we go to the next 6 biases from number 7 to number 12, I'm going to go much faster here because they are easier to understand than the first 6.
Okay, well, so far I'm guilty as charged on most of the list. Keep going.
So priming involves being influenced by information received right before making decisions. You're going into a meeting and someone meets you just before you get in and says, be careful about that. So that becomes really a big factor in that meeting if you want to make some decisions. Number 8, the project influence. So you're basing your decisions based on what and not why. You like this project so much, so I'm going to fund it, but I don't really know why I'm doing that. It's just this project seems appealing to me. Politics, we all have that. So the person who has the most influence in the room makes most of the decisions, and that happens all the time. The personal influence here is who versus why. I mean, how many times people that are responsible for budgeting, they give money to people or to departments or to projects that have people that they like, and as opposed to other people, and that causes a lot of problems but that's the personal influence bias. And then the dominant criterion. Dominant criteria is, according to psychology research that's been done a long time ago, they say that the human brain, the human brain cannot hold more than 7 ± 2 elements at the same time. So people cannot hold a lot of information in their mind at the same time, so they come up with dominant criterion. So Clark, if I ask you, if you want to go to dinner tonight, where do you want to go? Probably within 2 or 3 seconds, you're going to tell me, let's go to this restaurant.
Right.
So it's not possible that during those 2 or 3 seconds you've thought about everything, but you probably thought about, well, I had this meal there once and it was really great. So that's all what you thought about. But you didn't think about how bad the service was or how far you have to drive or how expensive it was, right? So the dominant criterion is about just one criterion that becomes so dominant in your mind that you use it to make the decision and ignore all the others.
Well, since it's number 11, nobody's going to remember it because they can only remember other.
You got to remember. Yes. And then there is thin slicing. Thin slicing happens when you make snap judgment based on first impressions. So to just eliminate those last 6 biases, I think the first thing that we have to do is have a structured decision-making process. So a structured decision-making process at least will help you understand the facts. And we'll talk about this in the second part of this webinar, but try to understand the facts about all the decisions that you make. And you have to understand very clearly what your priorities are and make all your decisions based on those priorities. And the other thing is, don't jump into projects. One of the things that I saw a lot when I work with organizations, and when they try to make decisions, they start looking at alternatives first. And then they start debating about those alternatives and arguing, with this project better than this, let's do that. But that should happen way in the end. In the beginning, all you have to do is just understand your priorities and try to define them clearly.
Okay.
So I hope I was a little bit fast, but I hope I covered that. And I hope with what we just talked about, that this provides awareness for the audience of these biases, and so that when they come into the next decision, they will think about it and they learn about it and then they avoid it.
Okay, so one question that came in relates to if somebody wants to get their project funded, like a lot of people want to get their project funded, that's okay, right? You want to convince people to get your project funded.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're going to cover that, and
I'll cover that in the next step.
Okay, so next we'll do another poll, and what we'd like to have you answer is, out of those 12 biases, what are the top 3 biases that impact you the most? And again, about 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
okay, the results are coming in.
Interesting, yeah. So that's it. So let's just end the polling. And I think if I can read this correctly, the status quo bias has like 50% of the participant. That's probably the highest one. No, the highest one here is like politics or personal influence, and then followed by the status quo, which is not surprising, and then maybe followed by the confirming evidence. So that's very interesting. There was like a good distribution, yeah. And even though those are the 3 top ones, every single one of the biases that we put up there had responses to it. So people actually, it's amazing. There's not one bias that people said, no, we never do that. It's all the biases that we put up there. Someone said that they do it or they fall into it. Okay, good.
Okay, great. So thanks for that. So that brings another question to mind. Since we're talking about bias, is there unbiased decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I spent the past 20 years trying to kind of eliminate those biases, right? How to create a structured process to be able to make those decisions without biases. So the method that I've created a long time ago, and now we have started using it with a lot of our clients, called the Averse method. So Averse come from two words, allocate and advance. So we believe that a decision is an allocation of some sort. So it's allocate and then advance, because the worst thing that you do that you can have when you make a decision is that you regret that decision. You think, well, I just made that decision, but I'm not sure that I, taken into consideration all the factors. I don't know if I made it. So you always keep regretting. You always keep thinking about it. So they call it Averse, because you allocate, you make the right decision, and then you move on. So when I created this, I looked at the decisions today. What organizations do today, and I find that most decisions are unstructured. They're biased. They're like a dartboard. It's random, and they're subjective. So when I created this method, I want it to be much more programmatic, unbiased, and strategically aligned. And we'll talk about this a lot in the next few minutes. Is that the main purpose of any good decision-making process is to align the work that you do with your priorities. So that has to be included in any good method. And then transform subjective criteria into objective criteria so that we can measure and score and use them.
Okay. So how do you know that your method produces the right decisions?
So that I get asked that question a lot. And my answer is always, what is the right decision? So if so if we have one right decision for everything, wouldn't we all be wearing the same clothes and be driving the same car, right? The fact that we don't means that there's no one right decision. So the right decision is the decision that's most aligned with your priorities. That's simple enough, right? So because we all have different priorities, we make different right decisions for ourselves. The problem that is there is that you don't always see that link between the decisions that you make and the priorities. That strategic alignment is always not visible. And what I try to do here is try to make that visible. So when you're making decisions or you're thinking about alternatives, you can immediately see the impact of those alternatives on your priorities. So the right decision is the one that most aligned with your priorities. That's the
but you're saying that top priorities generally aren't visible or tied.
Not just the priorities, the link between what you do. And you remember the example of the executive that told me that they started this program and they thought they selected good projects, but they had to wait until all the projects are complete to find out that these are not the right projects that they should have selected. What we're trying to do here is try to find out whether it's the right projects or the wrong projects from the very beginning, before you actually make these decisions.
Okay, well then, introduce us to the method.
Sure. So the method has 5 different steps and logical steps. And as I said, we always make the scoring and selecting of projects towards the end. So the first step is strategize. Strategize is what's important to you. Can you identify and quantify what's important to you? What are your strategic priorities as an organization, as a department? What are your strategic value? How do you measure your strategic value? All that. Number 2 is compare. Compare is, out of all these strategic priorities that you identify, which one is more important? So how to obtain the relative weights between all your priorities and objectives. And then the third one is quantify, is try to create a scale of measurements. We call it a metric, measurement scale, whatever, for each of the objectives that you have, so that you can score projects. Because as I told you before, if you look at the car example, you can look at a car and say it's a cheap car or an expensive car. But if style is one of your priorities that you have in buying a car, style, right? And I tell you, how much does this car score in style? How do you say that this car is 7 out of 10 in style, right? It's very subjective. So the quantify step is about creating a scale to measure each one of those objectives so that we can score alternatives against that. And now steps 1, 2, and 3 covers identifying of priorities and measuring them and all that. And now, in step 4 and 5 is only when we introduce all the alternatives and we start to score them in the system, and then select the ones that are mostly aligned with our priorities. And when we say select the ones that are mostly aligned, we say like a simple, like if you select this, these priorities are going to turn green or red or yellow, right? It's very clear how these projects that you select will impact your priorities. So this is, in a nutshell, in a nutshell what the method is about. So the end result, the end goal has to be strategic alignment, like I told before. So wouldn't it be great if we have a graph or a chart like we have on the board here? Wouldn't it be great to have the strategic value of all your alternative measured, and then you have the vertical axis here, so strategic value. And there are two other elements other than strategic value that I found from my experience to be very important. One is complexity and another one is urgency. And why is complexity important? Complexity is important because, technically speaking, if you look at the top left quadrant, these are projects that are highly strategic and easy, right? So measuring complexity might help you identify what your quick wins are. So if you have two projects that have the same strategic value, one is easier than the other, I would start with the easy one first. And then the third factor is the urgency, because people often, and this happens all the time, mistake urgency for importance or for strategic value. I mean, I talk to people all the time and they say, oh, this project is so important because we have to do it before April, for example. Well, that doesn't make it important, that makes it urgent. If you have a roof that's falling and you have to fix it, that's not going to make your company strategically more important. It's just you just have to do it because it's urgent. So urgency is the measure of risk. So wouldn't it be great if we can create something like this that has the strategic value measured, the complexity and the urgency and the cost, and then you can make educated decisions based on that? That's exactly what I wanted to do when I created this method, but also created a software application to go with the method that will help all the decision makers go through that process in a much easier way. So if you look at the first step, which is the strategize step, things that we need to understand is that every organization has to create the strategic value scorecard for themselves. The strategic value scorecard determines what's important and what's not important. And there are a lot of techniques to create this. We're not going to get into that right now, but you have to understand that when you create your strategic priorities, they have to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. What does that mean? That means that they have to be as independent from each other as possible, and also it has to cover the whole spectrum. You can't leave anything out. By doing this strategic value scorecard right, then you eliminate a lot of the bias. If you look at the right side of the screen, you can eliminate a lot of the biases that we talked about just by coming up with a strategic value scorecard that represents the true priorities of your organization. The second step is, now that we know our priorities, how can we decide on which priority is more important than the other? And I know that people in this room for sure, but people in the audience have done this 100 times in their careers. When you have 5 or 6 things that you want to prioritize, all you do is say, you know, I will give a score from 1 to 10 to each one. So first one you give 8, the second one you give 4, and then the third one you do 6, right? We've done this all the time, right?
Yeah.
Did you do that, Clark, before for a lot of things? Yeah. And that's completely wrong. And why is it completely wrong? Because I'm sorry, but it is wrong.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah. And why is it wrong? It's because this is called relative weight. It's coming from relations. So if you say something is 8 and something is 4, you better mean that that is twice as important as this. If that's not how you think about it, then the number 8 and 4 doesn't mean anything, right? And it produces the wrong results. So in our method, we use something called pairwise comparison. I'm sure some of the audience might be familiar with that. We use pairwise comparisons to come up with these priorities. And in this exercise, what we do is we have the group discuss only a pair of choices at a time. And once they come up which one is more important than which, we go on to the next pair and so forth. So 2 things that we have here. There's an algorithm that, based on this pairwise comparison, calculates the relative weights automatically without having to ask the audience any numbers. And the other thing, it also measures the inconsistency of the group that are making these decisions, which was pretty cool thing to have, really, is that you have a group that's trying to come up with some decisions, and this will measure the consistency of them doing that. So we measure the consistency of this discussion. The third thing, like we talked about before, is the quantify step. The third step is the quantify step, which now we take each one of our strategic priorities and try to develop a scale to be able to do that. And the way we do this is that, because these objectives and priorities that every company will come up with will be completely subjective, and it will be relating more to this company than other companies, Then I work with some subject matter experts for these companies to come up with 3 levels of desirability for each one of those objectives. So what would be a high desirability, what would be a medium desirability, what would be a low desirability. And based on that, we can fit those by scale. So now, even if we talk about something like buying a car and the style, we will be able to define high desirability style, medium desirability style, and low desirability style, and create a curve like that for that, so that when we're looking at different cars and different vehicles that we want to buy, now we can score cars based on style in a very easy and objective and quantifiable way.
So shared subjectivity.
Shared subjectivity. So I meet with the subject matter expert and say, what do we all agree a high desirability style? What's the definition of that? So we do that, and then we come up with these curves. And this is a part of the research that I did in my PhD, is using the utility theory to come up with these curves. So we don't want to talk a lot about that because we don't have time, but this is how this works.
Still pretty interesting.
Thank you.
So next step is another poll. And to ask all of you out there, do you have your strategic priorities defined, prioritized, and quantified? The 3 choices there will be yes, no, or I don't know.
Yep. So we're asking here everyone that in the organization to tell us whether those 3 steps, you know, whether they have them nailed down in their organizations, and they have everybody in the organization know what the strategic priorities are, and are they identified and quantified. So as you know, as expected, when I do this, we have almost about 91% of the people in the audience said that they either don't have it or they're not sure. Because if they're not sure, I think they don't have it if it's available. But 91% says that they kind of don't have it, and only 9% said that they do, which we find working with a lot of organizations.
Do you find that when you have with your clients and you have a decision team together, do they tend to even agree on what their strategic priorities are?
No, of course not. It takes a long time. You know, it takes a long time and a long facilitation to just even, because you have to understand that there might be different agendas here, and it's okay. It's not like a bad thing. I mean, if you're sitting with the CXOs of a company, and you have a CFO sitting there concerned about money and budgets, and you have a COO concerned about operations, and someone concerned about safety, these are conflicting interests. That's why that's why having a structured approach like this, have all those 3 people talk together and try to come up with a consensus. So yes, absolutely.
So in your 5-step methodology, you tend to spend most of your time on 1, 2, and 3, strategize, compare, and quantify?
But it depends, because 4 and 5 deals with actual alternatives and projects. So a company that has 10 or 20 projects different. I work with companies that have 700 projects that they want to do construction with. So yeah, so it depends on that. But there's a lot of time that's spent in trying to come up. But once you do it becomes a great scorecard for the organization that they can measure everything against that.
Okay. Well, I know you're doing some work with the state of Michigan. So comment on how they do this, how they're implementing it, and what results are they seeing?
So the state of Michigan, they have an office called the Office of Performance and Transformation. And the Office of Performance and Transformation is responsible for implementing lean and process improvement across the agencies. So the state has like 19 agencies, and each agency submits requests for lean projects and process improvement. The OPT, or the Office of Performance and Transformation, has some internal consultants that go to these agencies and facilitate that. The problem is, imagine 19 agencies want to implement lean at the same time. How many requests does this agency get every year? But they have only a few people. So we started working together with them on trying to prioritize their lean. So they came up, they actually were able to identify the strategic priorities very, very, very well. So they said, you know, if the project aligned, one of the priorities was department goals. Does the project align with department goals? One other thing was burdensome rule reduction, because as a state, you want to reduce the burden on the citizens as much as possible. IT funding, you know, does this project include IT in it? So they came up with 5 strategic priorities, And then we worked together to come up with the weights of these priorities, and we created curves and scales for each one of those. Then they applied the rest, the two other steps to the model that we'll talk about in a minute, and they now prioritizing their projects based on that. It was a very, very great experience for me personally, and I hope for them as well, that they find it now very quantifiable.
So before you started this with them, they did not have a structured process?
No, they did not. And as a matter of fact, talking to Holly, who's the director, she said that, it was like creating a prioritization model just doesn't sound fun. And she said, in fact, some of us dread carving out time to create a structure. But then after we worked with her, she said, I'm happy to say, I think that what we found was not just a model with scoring and weighting, but a method that helped us think more deeply about work. And she said, I also have to admit, it was fun to create and all that. So I was pretty happy with the results that we achieved with the state.
Okay, so next is another poll, I believe.
No, I think we want to continue with the methodology, like
Okay.
steps 4 and 5 first. So now that we have all our objectives quantified and all that, then the number 4 is scoring, which basically let's bring in all the projects or all the alternatives that we have, and then the system will score it automatically based on the strategic priorities. And each project will then get a strategic scorecard that would say how much this project scored. Then you have to understand that projects will impact multiple priorities and objectives, but I doubt that one project will score 100 out of 100, because that means that this project is perfect for all the priorities. So we have to understand that this is kind of a balanced scorecard approach where every project is going to impact something and not others. So that's the step, that number 4, which is scoring. And then the final step then is the selection step. And in the selection step, it's kind of like creating that graph that we talked about, where strategic value and complexity and urgency. And then we also included, you can manually select some projects and see how it impacts your strategic priorities, as you can see in the screen here, or you can actually let the system optimize for certain goals and certain objectives that you have. The system can optimize that for you.
So if I still want to pick my project, I can
Oh, of
still
course.
pick my project?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you can pick whatever projects you want, and you include your budget here too, so that if you pick a project, then your budget gets reduced by that amount. So you always know how much money do we have left in the project.
Okay, so here's a poll,
Yeah.
and that is, do you use a structured decision process in your organization?
Yeah. So now that we explain what a structured decision-making process may look like, do you think you have a structured decision-making process in your organization?
Oh, yikes. Oh,
I'm hoping that's just one person.
okay, yeah, it was.
Yeah. So we're waiting here for some results.
People are changing their minds back and forth. I don't know what
That's
that
good.
means.
That's good. But almost similar to the first one, we feel that, almost 77% of the people saying that they either don't have a structured process or they're not sure. But the good news is we have 23% of the people that actually are using structured decision-making process to do that. That's good. Yeah.
Okay. So Sharif, I don't remember you mentioning it today, but we've talked about this before. You mentioned decision coaching.
Right.
Yeah.
So for example, when I work with the state of Michigan, I acted as a decision coach. Basically, it's to go through the process with them. Okay. So we want to create a community of decision coaches across multiple industries that can use this method to guide organizations into these decisions. So a decision coach is someone who's going to become an expert in using this process and becoming a decision-making expert. They will become an unbiased facilitator, a great facilitator, to be able to extract, as we said before, this might be tough discussions. And we also, he or she is going to be an excellent communicator, right? So they can communicate with people, and they will be certified in the Averse method. So some exciting news is that now we're partnering with the University of Michigan Economic Growth Institute right here in Ann Arbor to create that decision coach certification program where people can go through the program and then become certified decision coaches.
God, that's good.
One part cat herder, one part peacekeeper, right? Good communicator.
It's you know, the process is the process and the method main thing. I mean, the software helps, but it's the process and how to follow the process. The software is kind of like a decision companion where you can use it to accompany you throughout the decision-making process. But how to use the process and how to do that is the main thing, and the decision coaches are going to be key to that.
Okay, so before we wrap up, can you talk a little bit more about the impact or the results that your clients are getting?
So, you know, before I would like to get a little bit into the questions that we've been receiving, but I want to, but I will talk a little bit about that, Clark. So my experience taught me that decision biases are bad for the organization. And if you combine decision biases together, it's even more dangerous. So as Susan said in the beginning, a recent article in Forbes said that 98% of managers fail to make decisions that are aligned with their priorities. And that wasn't, I mean, the number I think is a little bit too high. I don't want to say I'm not surprised. I thought it would be around 70, 80, but 98%, that means almost 100% don't do that, which is weird. I don't know. Yeah, it's a little bit strange. But what I want to leave the audience with, I want you to, you know, once you listen to this, and we will send you this presentation, I want you to start thinking about how to develop awareness in your organization and put this advice or the comments that we made today into action. I want the audience to start thinking about that. I want the audience to start thinking which traps do they think they struggle the most as a team, and are they at risk of falling into any of those traps and biases on the projects that they're working on right now? I want you to start think like that, and I want them also to think about what advice from this presentation makes sense for their group, you know, and how can they put together into action immediately or in the future. So I want you just to get something out of this. Think about it. Think about the traps that you might be facing, and then start thinking about how do we put something in action to be able to eliminate those biases or to minimize the impact of those biases. So most of the clients that I work with, we achieved some of these results on the screen here. You know, we really got some visibility into strategic alignment. Particularly exciting was, you know, if I select those projects, these things turn green. All these strategic priorities turn green, and this one turned red. So maybe let's try to choose something else. They start, you know, seeing almost the results of the projects. And one of the steps that we do after the projects are completed is we try to score the projects again and see if they actually achieved all the assumptions and all the benefit realization that they thought it would achieve in the beginning. So
yeah, I recall one meeting I was with you, Sharif, and the client said that they'd been fighting about just a strategic priority process for
a year and a half.
2 years.
Yeah, a year and a half. Yes, exactly.
And in 1 or 2 sessions with a decision coach, they were able to flesh that out in a way that everybody was in consensus,
correct,
agreement about what those were.
So better collaboration. People ignore that in organization. I mean, where does the decision? I mean, I heard one consultant that I know, he told me there's almost like a layer of clay between the top management of the company and the rest of the employees, meaning like all the priorities that have been decided on the top, none of the employees know anything about that. Mm-hmm. So this process here is going to make sure that the projects that you select are not only prioritized and ranked, but also good projects, because we measure the strategic value here. So if the best project that you have scores 23 out of 100, that means that the best project, that all the project you have is not good enough. So you need to think about other projects. And this layer of clay that he was mentioning between the top management and the employees need to be transparent as much as possible. So at least employees can think of better projects. And particularly when you start to embark on a lean journey or something, because once you embark on a lean journey, like Clark said in the beginning, you will have hundreds of things that you can do. What are the best things that you can put your resources in? So we can now take questions.
Well, there are a couple of questions, and if anybody has a question, go ahead and write them in. There are a couple that I will read to you, and we've maybe already covered on.
Sure.
Can anyone become a decision coach?
So when we start selecting decision coaches to go through that program, I think a decision coach has to have some attributes. So, for example, they have to have some business experience, and they have to have some personality that will enable them to be able to facilitate this. Because these discussions sometimes are tough. And so I guess by training, everyone can eventually become a decision coach, but people that can really become decision coaches are people that have that business acumen and facilitation experience.
Okay, great. One other question: how do I implement, or how could I implement in my organization?
How you implement something like this method in your organization? Well, the implementation starts by understanding, working with a decision coach to understand what are the priorities are, and then go through the process basically. So to implement this, the first thing to do is try to understand what decisions are we making in the organization, and how do we model each decision separately, and who are the people that have to be involved in these decisions. So try to work with a decision coach to get that moving through. Yeah.
Clark, are any other questions that you?
No, I don't have any questions, no. But we're coming to the end of the time. Anybody else?
Well, it's interesting just to mention that, you mentioned the work that we have with the state of Michigan. So we are going to have a breakout session in the annual annual convention or the annual conference this year in August, yes. And we are the state of Michigan, the Office of Performance and Transformation, and myself are going to have a breakout session over there to explain what we did. And also it will be a chance, actually, I will have people have hands-on experience on this process, and actually try to take a case study and divide people into groups and have decision coaching and work it, so that people who understand how to implement this will get a much better idea of how this will work in their organizations.
Okay, so if you hadn't signed up for the annual conference, it's a chance to do so. All right, anything else?
In terms of resources, I think I mentioned at the beginning, Clark, you'll be able to distribute a deck of the slides.
Yes.
If anybody would like that. We'll have the recording, so if anybody missed some of it and would like to listen to that. I think that's anything else, Sharif?
No, I enjoyed it. I thank you so much for all the audience and for all the people that were involved in this, and I hope you learned something.
All right.
Well, I have. It's been pretty interesting and most helpful. I wish I'd have had this about 50 years ago.
No kidding.
It avoids some of these.
Can think of a few decisions, yeah.
Yeah. And thanks to the audience. I hope all of you are still there. I encourage you to reach out and to our website, which will have the slide deck on it. That's about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.